Welcome to Talking Roadmaps, the channel where we talk about all the good things, the bad things, and the ugly about road mapping. Today, I'm joined by Bob. Bob, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Bob Moesta. I'm a product person. I've been, as my mom would tell you, I was an engineer out of the womb. I started breaking things by the time I was 2. I started fixing things by the time I was 5, and have been on the product path since then. I've worked on over 3,500 products. I've worked on things like the guidance system for the Patriot missile, Base Camp, and Pokemon mac and cheese, and everything in between. So I'm one of those guys who just like, I'm annoying, but at the same time, I love to build stuff.
And you're also missing out a key part there, Bob. I know you're very well known in the jobs to be done space.
Yeah. So the other thing is I've had 3 close head brain injuries. I can't read and I can't write, and so jobs was a method that I had developed mostly for myself because of that disability, and ultimately it's led me to teaching it to other people. And so I'm the co-architect of the Jobs to Be Done framework as well.
Love it. And I'm a big fan of Jobs to Be Done as a concept and putting them on your roadmap in particular.
Yes, we'll talk more about that. That's good.
If you're enjoying the channel, subscribe, hit the bell, and give us a like. I mean, I normally ask the question at the start, what's the purpose of the roadmap? But I'm going to rephrase that. What's the job to be done of a roadmap?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting thing. So when you dig deep into a roadmap has multiple, purposes, right? Part of it is a way in which to think about what we're going to do in the future, right? It's a set of expectations we set to both management as well as investors of what we're going to do, as well as it sets expectations for customers on what we're going to do, right? And the hard part is that there's so much unknown between where you are and where you need to go, and that we end up making promises we can't deliver on. And so to me, I'm a very big fan to realize number one is we plan when we're the stupidest. And then management holds us accountable to our stupidity. Like if we thought we should change in like 2 weeks or 3 weeks because we're now smarter, we can't most of the time because we made a commitment before. And so this whole thing is, to me, is a roadmap is about something that has to unfold or unroll, but it's this aspect of realizing like it's not something that's set in stone, but it's more about kind of the direction and magnitude in which we want to go to certain places. And so to me, one is we talk about, so for me, when I think about, there's 2 types of road mapping. There's the next 90 days, and then there's after 90 days. And between now and 90 days is typically where, for at least for me and my teams and that I work with, we end up, being able to know exactly what we need to do over the next 90 days, what we need to go build, what are the outcomes we're trying to get, kind of all that detail. But after 90 days, to be honest, we're actually only talking about struggling moments we're going to go after, not features we're going to build, because the features themselves might be obsolete by the time we get there. And so ultimately, if you think about ChatGPT, it like changed everybody's roadmap, because at some point and really it's a tool. It shouldn't change the roadmap. It shouldn't change the struggling moments we go after, but it might change the way we talk about a feature or the sequence of features we go build because of the outcomes we want to go make. And so I start with the outcomes that we're trying to get to as opposed to the things we're trying to build.
Totally agree. I mean, I often joke that last year, everyone had AI, and for probably the last 5 years, had AI in the 3-year out column on their long-term roadmap. Then suddenly it pulled into, we need it now.
That's right. And they're like, well, where should we use it? I'm like, well, where are people struggling? Like it shouldn't be that hard. It should be something that slots in on top of it. And so what happens is when we start to make commitments of, oh, we're going to build this feature, we're going to build this widget, it's like, okay, why? And a lot of times you start to realize, most of the time, at least, again, I'm an engineer, and I was taught a lie. The lie I said is build it and they will come. And so every time I'd come up with a feature, it's like, well, somebody's going to want that. We're going to have that. And so we end up putting all these features on there, but we end up not realizing kind of the implication, both from an investment perspective, but also from a market perspective. And so it's not just about what we can build. It's about what are they struggling with, because it's a 2-sided problem. We have to be able to build something that we can execute on, but it has to go into a moment where people want to do something new or do something different because the old way doesn't work. And that's the other part that's always missing to me from roadmaps, is it's about what we can do versus what we should do.
Totally love it. And I love those different lenses, the 90-day and the beyond 90-day. Now, I wonder, for the types of content that's on there in those different timeframes? Are there different audiences, different people looking at it, different people care about those different views?
Yeah, this is to me always the hard part, is how do you package the roadmap? Because at some point it's not that you need 3 different ones, but you have to realize that 3 different audiences are looking at them. And so ultimately the fact is that this is one of the things, and to me the most dangerous one is always the sales one. We're putting this on the roadmap and we're telling people we're going to sell this, which we're going to build this, and they can be able to buy it. But it forces people to wait. It forces people to at some point in time, we really don't know what the feature is. There's a lot of, kind of bad decisions that are made around kind of adding things to the roadmap just from sales perspective, right? So ultimately, I consider the roadmap a strategic document that requires input from all the different people, as opposed to something that the product person is just pulling together to say, this is what I wanted to go do, right? That's part of it. But at the same time, it's about what's the implications to the rest of the organization as you build those things out.
So agree. So aligned there, Bob.
It's a living, breathing document. It's not like it's never done. It's something that's like, it's our latest look into today. We can use it to diagnose what we've done in the past and how well we're actually good at this. But it's a process, right? And so when it's a process, there's no end. And so we just have to realize, like, it's not about perfection. It's about what is the real purpose of it. And I feel like half the time we're using it to measure, like, millimeters when it's a yardstick. Right? They're trying to be way too precise at the wrong places in time.
That phrase used there, the roadmap is never done. It's the same as software, right? The software is never done. The product is never done. The roadmap is never done.
But it's partially is to realize, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do with the time? Is the most precious of all our resources. Like we keep thinking about it, money, but really it's time. And what do we want the teams to spend time on? And what do we want them not to spend time on? And so to me, the roadmap is about helping prioritize the time and knowing the boundaries of when have we gone too far, when is it too much, and ultimately, this is why I subscribe to Ryan Singer's version of fixed time variable scope as opposed to fixed scope variable time. Because what happens is, if it's fixed scope, we're never done. But if we fix the time, we basically are saying, what can we get done within this period of time that's most useful to the product or to the feature? And we end up getting way more progress than trying to do it under a fixed scope and variable time.
I mean, that feels like we've only got 2 of the parts of the iron triangle. We've not got the quality and the risk element on there.
Yeah. So there's quality, cost, and timing, right? Those are the three things. And so if we fix the time, right, that in some cases we're fixing the cost, but ultimately by shaping it in a space that we can actually think in and see in and be like, so for example, the cycles we're talking about are 6 weeks to 8 week cycles, right? And so there are times where we can see what we have to build, but there's still a lot of unknown. And so it's not about, to me, road mapping is not about product planning in terms of like, here's what everybody's going to do every week. It's about kind of the direction we're going and what we're working on now and what we're not working on in the future, right? Or not working on until the future, if you will. And so it's about that prioritization of our time and our focus. That's to me what the role of the roadmap is, and to realize how does it play out and what is the sequence of things we need to build, as opposed to just kind of thinking about them as one-off things that we just do.
Absolutely. Now, you already started to hint at this, that quite often the roadmap is the list of desires that the product manager wants to create. So who owns it? Who maintains it? Whose artifact is it?
I think about it as it's the head of product. Ultimately, they're the person who owns the communication around it, and it's their job to pull everybody's input into it, as well as to be able to kind of communicate it back out. And so to me, it's setting expectations and being able to kind of prioritize, if you will, time investments, or prioritize what we're going to do and when we're going to do it, right? It's not, I think of it as it layers across the top. It's not all the details of what we're going to do, but it's kind of this directional piece of what we're doing and more importantly, what we're not doing.
And I guess layering maybe a layer above that, we've got strategy, vision, objectives. How do they link in then?
So to me, strategy is the almost like the game we have to play in terms of what we have to achieve in order to be competitive. The product roadmap is then the ways in which we can achieve competitive success through product. But there's also sales, there's also operations, there's still a whole bunch of other places we can achieve it. But think of it as, the way I always thought about it is product development was the engine to actually drive strategy. And so to me, the product roadmap is the engine that drives product strategy. And so ultimately, the strategy is about the bigger business. The product strategy is what are we going to do actually to contribute to that bigger strategy.
And so we've got the kind of the vision, strategy, and kind of objectives leading into it. And you talked about kind of the lower level execution level detail. What else links into the roadmap? I feel like it's this almost, it can act almost like a central hub to a lot of things to unify them.
So the thing is I think of I think of the stuff that we're building is more bets than for sure things, right? And so we plan like they're going to happen as opposed to plan like it's a bet. And so I think of road mapping, the other like angle that I bring to this is it's more about reserving capacity. You could say it's budgeting, but it's really about reserving capacity for the work we have to do. And how are we going to actually, we're going to work on this and not that. And here's what we're going to focus on. And we've got this much time or this many resources to work on this problem or this opportunity. And so it's about reserving capacity as opposed to knowing exactly what we're going to do. And if you really, having worked on so many products, I realized like I would spend so much time planning and those plans would always change. But if I actually just planned a little bit differently, I could actually be way more effective with it and realize that I'll figure the details out in the work, not before the work.
Although there is that good old phrase of a plan is useless and planning is invaluable. I think the thought process.
It's a verb. It's a verb. It's not a noun. And so in some cases, it's like, that's why it's never done. It's never a document that's there. It's about planning is what we're talking about, not plans.
I often say the same thing. Road mapping is the activity. The roadmap just happens to fall out of it as an artifact and be useful.
Well, it's a sense making exercise, right? To figure out kind of like if we want to do all these things, and it's typically we have 10 pounds of stuff to put into a 5-pound bag. And so part of this is the roadmap is about helping us kind of prioritize and sequence and realize what are those things that have to come before something else, and ultimately how do we commit to the organization so they know where we're going without actually detailing where we're going to go. And so to me, it's very similar to in the military, they have something called commander's intent. And commander's intent is about what we're trying to achieve, the outcomes we're trying to get to, and kind of the resources that we have. But it's not telling people what to do at each play of the mission, right? And so it's letting the people on the front lines make the decisions they need to make, but letting them have a framework around it so they're not going out of bounds. And so that's really what to me is we're trying to do is realize like there's a lot more unknown here, and treating it like a bet and reserving capacity is better than saying it's a plan and we have a goal and we're going to hit this launch date. Right, because we almost never hit the launch date.
Or we might hit the launch date, but we might change the scope if we go back to that fixed time variable scope.
Exactly. That's what I realize is that it's easier. It's better to like if you realize the 80-20 rule, right? And you iterate it. So if I get 20% of the things that get me 80% of the effects, and I do one iteration, I'm at 80. If I do another iteration, I got 20% left. I get 20% of that is 16. And so ultimately I'm able to get to basically 98% with 2 iterations. With 3 iterations, I can actually be way better off than I am trying to do it in 1 iteration. And this is the whole point, is that we don't know everything until it starts to happen. And so this is where we keep thinking we know all the answers, but the reality is there's way more unknown than there is known. And we have to remember that as we're building.
Yeah, and I often like to put the bets or the hypotheses or these things onto the roadmap, possibly even the discovery that we're doing on the roadmap to understand things.
I think hypotheses are important, but to realize there's still a lot more unknown. Like this is where, like for me, a lot of the jobs research that I do is I don't actually go in with hypotheses. I actually come out with hypotheses. And so it's a very different kind of research, where most research is conducted under the notion of you have a hypothesis, how do you prove it or disprove it, depending on the method you're using. But ultimately, I would always say I'm not smart enough to even know how to form a hypothesis. How do I just go understand what causes your customer to say today's the day they're going to buy? And so ultimately it's about forming hypotheses. And so to me, the roadmap should be about helping us put together the hypotheses and be able to figure out what's the work we have to do to either prove out those hypotheses or form better hypotheses. I mean, this is how do I say, this is the nitty gritty. This is like, I love this part of the work. At the same time, it's like, I just do this work. I usually don't get a chance to talk about it. I don't tell many people about it. And I do it all the time. It's like second nature. So this is very refreshing to be able to kind of explain to you kind of how, at least how I think about planning and looking forward and doing roadmaps. This is awesome.
Well, that's the whole point of the channel is to get many views from many different angles to move the craft of road mapping forwards.
I think that's a really good premise of it's a craft and you have to make it work for you. And just because it works for me doesn't mean it works for you as well. And so part of this is to realize you have to find your way. And when you get really good at it, it's one of those things that then you have to pass it forward. And so my thing is we're all finding our way. And at the same time, there's no, especially in the product space, there's some tools, but not many, right? And so we need, I'm not sure we're ready to standardize a road mapping tool, but I think we're better off actually thinking about road mapping as a craft, like you said. I think that's really nice.
It's one of those things I have come across organizations that have time-based, feature-based roadmaps who are kicking ass, delivering great value to their customers. It's like, if it ain't broke, let's not fix it.
That's right. Well, and part of it is to at least study it, to understand why is it useful, why is it successful, so you understand how to make sure that you can double down on the good stuff, and as well as look backward. Any process should be improved, right? And so I'm not one to just like, if it ain't broke, don't screw with it. But it's more about how do we think about where are the weaknesses in it, where are the struggling moments around it, where are the different things we can actually change to make it better. I think that's human nature. Our human nature is to make things better. It's just not everybody's aligned at the right time.
Yeah, and I guess that comes back to the jobs to be done angle of like, actually the roadmap is there to do a job, and what we have today might be working today, but we still might be able to do that job better by iterating on how we do it.
The way that I would say it is that the roadmap doesn't have a job, it does a job, right? And so it does a job for people. And so this is where you have to realize people are the only thing that have jobs. And so ultimately we want to be able to understand what are the people that are consuming the roadmap? What are the real progress you're making by using the roadmap? If the roadmap is the solution, what's the context in which I pull it out? What is the outcome I'm really seeking from it? And how do I make sure that process is most useful for me? I feel like there's a lot of people who do roadmaps that are just useless, but they can't even call it useless because at some point they just keep saying like, well, this is what everybody else does, we should do it too. And it's not helping them. And so that at some point they have to actually figure that out. I call it like whitewashing. Like a lot of people whitewash these concepts and they don't realize they're deeper than they need to be. And if you whitewash it, you make it work. Jobs is a very good example of that. You can sit around and think about the jobs your customer has, but I can guarantee, and I know that I'm wrong 100% of the time. And so you have to realize that you have to go out and talk to people to get jobs.
If we've got this thing in front of us that's called a roadmap, what are the key elements that make it up? What's on the page?
The first orientation to me is time, right? And it's like how are we looking at time? And it's usually for me, time is horizontal, not vertical. And it's where are we and where are we going? And it's about levels of clarity, like almost the time horizon, like how far out can I really see? And ultimately, there's this first part that's on the left side that is about the next 90 days of things we have to do. And then as we play things out through time, they become less. There's different elements to the roadmap. There's customer facing features, there's processes, and then there's infrastructure. And we have to look at each one of those as in terms of the roadmap and how they sequence together, because they all require engineers' time. And so we have to look at capacity and capability in terms of those things as well. And so we have to, as we start to think through the roadmap, we have to also think about kind of the load on the system and the capability and capacity of the system as we look at that roadmap. The organization, like I consider it like the product, the technical resources to go convert the idea into code, right? We only have so many engineers, we only have so many designers, we only have so many, who have different skill sets. And as I build projects, I have to manage that project set against the portfolio of all the other projects, as well as the capability and capacity of the organization. And so that's where, to me, road mapping is about. It's a way in which to kind of see how things work, play things out, prototype things out, and then be able to see kind of how we need to sequence things and where are the interdependencies between them.
Yeah, I'm feeling an interplay of two earlier guests, of Jana Bastow, who often calls a roadmap a prototype for your strategy. And so there's that prototyping out. And then Simon Whitkiss, who talked about it's also going to be realistic and consider the capacity of the organization to deliver, and those two things interplaying.
But that's ultimately the aspect of what I call the supply side and the demand side. The supply side is what can we do and what's the capacity we have, and the demand side is what do we need to build for whom and how fast do we need to build it. And so this is where you have to actually address the fact that if things are more important or need to be developed before something else, it literally has a dependency on the capacity, and you have to be able to play those things out. And so to me, that these are all elements that to me are on part of the roadmap.
And so you talked about time going left to right. I've actually got my favorite visualization at the strategic level these days is actually a radial where it starts in the center and goes out, because it makes people think a little bit longer, because it's not that classic left to right timeline. And that pause, I think, is quite valuable. Beyond that, do you have any preferred ways of kind of visualizing?
I don't. I think the most important thing is it's not how I want to visualize. What I've learned over the years is the way I want to visualize it. Nobody gets it. And so what I realized is, like, you have to design it for the consumer. And so I have to think about what makes sense to the engineers and to everybody else in the organization as we go through it. And if I make it too in some cases too useful for me, I spend more time explaining what it is. And so I start to realize, like, I have this balance of trade-offs I have to make between what's the best way for me to see it and where I can see it as a glance, and what's the best way for them to see it so they can actually make sense of it.
What sort of tool do you typically use to visualize it, though?
Right now, so I work inside very large organizations and very small organizations, right? In large organizations, they have lots of, I'll say, corporate tools to do that kind of thing. In startups, we use mostly things like Miro and templates in Miro to basically walk through it. That way we can actually keep it going and see how it evolves through time. The worst one is to do it in PowerPoint, right? I think I still see it in PowerPoint. I can't believe it, but I still see it in PowerPoint. And then there's some tools out there. I think June has, there's some road mapping tools that are out there as well. But I haven't seen much of that. I've done mostly either big corporate stuff that's in, I'll say, things like Oracle and things like that, or there's Miro is the most common tool that I would say most people are visualizing it in.
I mean, there's a whole range of tools. Like in the physical product space, you have people like Sharp Cloud that are around you, but you've got people like ProdPad and Aha and Product Board and Craft and AirFocus. There's a bunch of them. Funny enough, all a number of guests in the near future or in the past mentioned there. I'll be honest, I go the other way to your perspective on PowerPoint. I don't want to host the data in PowerPoint. I want there to be a single source of truth somewhere, but I'm going to render it probably in PowerPoint because it's the most flexible, so I can tune it for the appropriate audience.
Okay, it just, to me, it's a very limited space by which I can think through it, and so it's typically I need. So I'm very old school when it comes to, like, I need to lay it out myself. So if you in my office here, I have whiteboards everywhere. And so I have one room that's 360 degrees whiteboard, and that's where we do a lot of product planning. Right. And so it's the fact that we can talk and argue and still whiteboard. But ultimately the fact is I need space. And so to me, PowerPoint seems to be limited. I might render it when I'm done into PowerPoint because that's the way people need to see it, but that's not true as much anymore.
And I think I'm with you. I'm seeing an increasing use of tools like Miro and Mural. Like yourself, I'm a big fan of whiteboards. There's a big one over there, a big one over there, or going onto the virtual whiteboard as well. And that thinking space, I agree. But when I come to present or to share it, I usually end up back in PowerPoint.
So I think that's the other part of this, is to realize it's a planning process. There are lots of tools you're going to use as you go through it. And one of the tools is I need a way in which to capture the thoughts. Another way is I need a way in which to render it so other people can read it. Like it's just like any other design process. You have to think through who the customers are. You have to think through kind of what are the key deliverables that you're trying to get to, and then ultimately figure that out. And so it's very meta, if you will, about how we think about product, but we should be thinking about, the roadmap as a product or as a process, and what are we going to, how do we design it to be most effective for us?
I even sometimes in an organization encourage a roadmap for the evolution from where it is to where they want to be.
I call that the second order, right? So I have some very, I'll say, good mentors. One of them was Dr. Deming, who was the father of quality. And he would always say, whenever you have a problem, you don't actually have one problem, you have two problems. The first problem is you got to solve the problem you've got. And then the second part is you got to then prevent it from happening again. And those are two completely different types of efforts to figure those things out. So every time something doesn't work, we've got multiple things to do. And so that's why, to me, it's so important to understand both sides of this in terms of, kind of who are the audiences and what do we really want to build, and how do we actually figure out the interdependence between those two to figure out the roadmap. So the roadmap is really a thinking tool more than anything else.
So what do you consider to be best practice in road mapping then, Bob?
This, you can decide if you want to cut this or not. You don't have to cut this, but I actually do not like the concept of best practices. I actually hate them, because best practices, at least when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, best practices what meant we would figure out what the best practice was, and then we'd never touch it again because it's the best practice. And so it actually causes us to have stagnant thinking, because we seek to find what we would call the best practice. And the best practice is the best practice today. It doesn't mean the best practice tomorrow. And so we end up constantly, stopping because we find the best practice and everybody follows the best practice, but then we work to the bottom as opposed to figuring out what's better, what's the next thing. And so to me, what I can talk about is there's key elements that are part of these things, but I think ultimately you have to be able to get this to where this is a tool that's useful for you, and ultimately it's not about a best practice, it's the best practice for you, right? And so that's where I get very scared about talking about best practices, because it's kind of like the development process. Like every organization should have their own development process. Most people want to talk about a generic one, but it doesn't help, right? So that's my little rant on best practices. So I don't think it's a useful concept for us to move towards, as opposed to the way I'd rephrase it, what are the key elements that have to be part of a good roadmap?
So maybe answer your own question then, Bob.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. So I can answer that. I think the first part is, again, I go back to this 90-day piece of like, I want to know what in this 90 days, we have fixed time. What's the scope we're going to actually attack at it? What's the bet we're making with this 90 days of time? And so it's about thinking about that we've got this time. What's the best use of this time wherever we are in the business? And then ultimately the roadmap. So that's kind of like what we're working on and what's happening, if you will, in the next 90 days. After that, it's then about almost reassessing and saying what's now most important, but we've got reserve capacity to do certain things. And so it's about reserving capacity with the intent of getting outcomes, but it's not necessarily we've decided the way in which to do it. So a lot of times road mapping is about figuring out the ways we're going to do things, but like it's kind of like budgeting. If you're going to tell me I need to spend so much money next November, I'm guessing. I have no idea what I should be doing next November. And so this is where we have to be able to realize that most planning is guessing, and that we can't create a level of precision to it when it's still guessing. And so this is where, as you move out farther, it's about actually having direction and magnitude than it is about the details of what we're going to do because of the unknown. And so to me, it's what are we doing in the next 90 days? What are the struggling moments we're going to hit? We're going to be addressing after that. What are the big unknown questions we have to answer? And what's the capacity and capability of the system as we're using it. Those are the things that typically I have on the roadmap.
Makes good sense. So let's flip it on its head. What's the biggest mistakes that you see in people when they're road mapping, or people doing when they're road mapping?
I'll start with the consequences. When you have a bad roadmap, you end up having to explain it a lot over and over again. It's constantly changing, and so you're having to affect more and more expectations, and you're changing expectations, and so you end up becoming a slave to the roadmap, because at some point in time everybody wants a level of precision. They're treating it with a level of precision. You don't really have it. You're guessing it, and now you're adjusting all the time, as opposed to saying, like, look guys, this is guessing. This is where we think we're going to be based on what we have right now, and let's say January of 2024, like this is what we're thinking about. But like when we get to March of 2024, here's what we were thinking we were going to do. Are we still going to do that? Like it's being able to do those things. And so I think part of this is that people think of road mapping as a 1-year exercise, as opposed to your point, a living, breathing document, a process. And it's about planning, not about the plan.
So whose advice on road mapping do you listen to, Bob?
So that's an interesting question, because this isn't something that I've studied a lot about, right? And it's like, it's not a rabbit hole I've gone down, and it's forcing me to think down this. But for the most part, I've been one to seek experts. So like Marty Kagan and Ryan Singer and Jason Fried's another good one. Des Trainer's another person I follow on these kinds of that kind of thinking. And so I tend to have a network of people that I would call on to say, like, when I have this problem, what would I do? And then they direct me in how I go. But like for the most part, I have an emergent notion of road mapping. So it's about, again, direction and magnitude as opposed to precision. And there aren't many people I know that subscribe to that. So I haven't had much. It's the projects I work on it that I use it this way. But my clients, at some point, I have to fall back to their planning process and their traditional roadmaps that I have to still work within. So I work within both.
So I think what you'll find, Bob, is actually your notion of road mapping is more commonly believed, in particular by the experts out there. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad practice and existing corporate practice, I'm going to say, that is a barrier to break through.
What's so interesting is I'm doing some work in the HR space. Like, what causes somebody to say, today's the day I'm going to leave this company to go to that company, right? And the interesting part is that I feel like at some point accounting or finance are putting their hands in this, and they're trying to influence the level of precision because they want it to relate back to money and if you will, spend, as opposed to what do we want to do. And so you start to realize, like, there's all these places where we're trying to account for something when there's nothing to account for yet. Right? And so I think that's part of the thing, is that people are pushing to make it more precise because accounting and finance, I call it the church of finance, wants to actually have their grip on it because it has implications to them. And when it changes, it changes their forecast, which has a huge set of implications. And so they start to realize, like, we need this to be more precise, but it can't be.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I very much, in the modern software agile world, believe that you can't fund the project, you can't fund the product, you're funding the team fundamentally. And what you're trying to do is get them to deliver the maximum value they can by solving the right customer problems. And hopefully the balance is that the higher the value, they're going to deliver more value than they cost.
Well, and this is so one of the things that I've been kind of harping on for a while is that we don't really have a good measure for the measure of good code. And so we're measuring everybody by the, if you will, the amount of keystrokes they make, amount of code they write. Like, there's all these, but those are all input metrics. Those aren't output metrics. And so you start to realize that at some point in time, when we talk about quality, cost, and performance, you start to realize that the fact is like, at some point, we know how to do time and cost, but the fact is we don't know how to measure the quality of the code. And these engineers are so expensive that we actually probably need a different way to work to actually help them think things through, as opposed to just write code all the time. So I think that's the revolution that I think that's going to come, is to look at a way in which to think about the quality of writing code, as opposed to, if you think about how much code do they write that ends up in the final product, and you start to realize that there's a lot of code that's written that's just scrapped, which is poor quality from where I grew up. And so part of this is to realize, how do we actually start to think about the measurement of good quality code and how to make code in a very different way than we do now. And I think that'll have a big impact on both capacity, capability, and the road mapping process.
It's one of the tenets of Scrum that you shouldn't be worried about teams actually having slack and being a little idle. But if you go back to your church of finance again, what they would look at that aghast. It's like, no, we need to be lashing the whip to get as much out of this individual as possible.
That's right. And there's a rhythm. Like anytime I've built something, there's a rhythm where you actually kind of like, there's intense pieces, and then there's pieces when you're apart, and then there's intense pieces again. And so part of it is to realize that like there's some merit to some of these things, and to try to actually just make it the machine that they want it to be, as opposed to the act of creation is creativity. And you can't actually have that going all the time. You need this ebb and flow of thinking and perspectives to make all that happen. So tell me about some of the other guests you had, and how they align to how I think about this. Because again, I'm not an expert in this area. You're the first person to really ask me about it. I use it all the time, but it's one of those things I've never thought about in terms of other people doing it or using it.
In particular, if we look at the software domain, because there are some differences in the physical product domain, the push towards a more outcome-oriented roadmap. And by outcomes, we have this whole mixture of what do we mean by an outcome. In the job to be done world, we'd be talking about a user outcome, something that actually serves them. And that's what I love to see on a roadmap. But when some people in the product world are talking about outcomes, they're more talking about product outcomes or change of customer behavior, something that's measurable, like, I don't know, reducing churn. And for me, that's a great objective, but it's not very useful in terms of how I'm planning towards it, how I'm thinking about what user jobs can I serve that will help reduce churn. That's kind of the causal link. And if I'm talking to a customer with an external roadmap, they don't care about me reducing churn. They care about how am I helping them to do their job better, to live their life better. And so that kind of principle of bringing the outcomes onto the roadmap is definitely a growing area. There's no doubt a lot of pushback, in particular often from the sales team, I find, more often than anybody else. The customer's usually quite relaxed about it, but the sales team themselves feel like, oh, you've got to put a date on it.
The sales team wants features. They want features and benefits, and so they want you to compete, go back, as opposed to the outcome, because there might be 4 different features I could actually use to get to that outcome, and I have to actually assess which one it is. And sales just wants to push the next feature. I mean, that's how they're trained.
And in fact, one of the tenets I find quite interesting is if you put the job on the roadmap or the outcome on the roadmap, it tends not to change that much. It tends to be quite a stable roadmap, because as we go along, we find one of those 4 optimum solutions, instead of saying this is the feature we're going to deliver, this is the solution. And then a week down the line, we've done some discovery, we realize, oh no, there's a better solution. We're still solving the same problem, but we've now got to change our roadmap because we learned something.
The other thing is they make the roadmap dependent on technology. And so what happens is that they're thinking about technology today for the future, but when they get to the future, there's now a different technology, and then they have to actually talk about 4 or 5 different ways to clarify everybody's expectations, because they thought you were going to go X and now you're going to go Y. And you start to realize, like, at some point, the technological decisions don't need to be made there. It's more about the direction, and then you can make the decision in the moment. But trying to think about the technology I'm going to use a year from now is kind of like, wow. Like those are tough decisions, especially in startups.
And the point is, you want to be giving the context to the technical leadership team of this is the direction of travel, so that then the technical leadership team can be thinking about, as they see new technologies, new opportunities, new ways of working, that could be a fit. Let's build the capabilities to be able to use it in 3, 6, 9, however months' time. If you had to distill your philosophy on road mapping down into 1 or 2 sentences, what would it be?
Planning is guessing, and that what we're trying to do is figure out direction and magnitude, not precision. That would be like the overall philosophy of it.
It's the classic question to end anything with is there anything else I should have asked you about road mapping that I didn't?
I was shocked to hear the lack of role of finance, or how finance integrates with the road mapping process, because it feels like they've got their fingers in it, but I don't have facts around that quite yet. And so I was anticipating hearing a little bit more about kind of like the need, finance's need for the roadmap, as opposed to product's need for the roadmap, or sales's need for the roadmap.
Yeah, I think I often see that need from finance, I should say, when it comes to the business case level conversations, which may be something you develop in parallel to an initial roadmap when you're justifying some investment, and maybe you have to present a version of the roadmap on your annual budget round, that sort of thing. So that's quite common in large corporate.
Yeah, it's the annualized process, and it's just part of the budgeting process.
And I'll be honest, I consider a lot of it to be what I call corporate theater.
That's exactly right. That's the best way to put it. I would say I worked at Ford many, many years ago, and that's what I felt like half the time was all about getting. It was all theater. There was technical pieces to it, but like to get anything done, it had to be some form of theater. It was very interesting.
Always just like to close out with an opportunity for you to give a pitch about who you are, or how people can get in touch, how you could help.
I teach now, so I'm a professor, or an adjunct professor at the Kellogg School of Business in Chicago, or Evanston, Illinois. I have a very small consulting firm where I advise startups and corporations on innovation. And you can find me on LinkedIn. And then I've got a couple of books that might be of interest. One is called Demand Side Sales, which is to stop selling and just help your customers make progress. So it's using jobs to be done to talk about the sales process. And then the other one is called Learning to Build, which is the book I wrote around kind of homage to my mentors. I had 4 very powerful mentors, and they taught me 5 skills that kind of are the foundation of how I think and how I build. And so it's called Learning to Build is the name of that book. And then we have the Circuit Breaker podcast, which is me and my business partner.
It's been great having you on the show, Bob. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me on.